Welcome to the Truth and Liberty broadcast. We believe we have a mandate to bring godly change to our nation and the world through the 7 spheres or mountains of influence. To further this cause, we give away a product every week that will empower you to get involved in changing your life and changing our world. You can register for our weekly giveaway by subscribing at truthandliberty.net.
Hello and welcome to a very special live cast that we're doing. I'm here with David Barton and E.W. Jackson. I tell you, these men are just awesome. I'm so privileged to call them friends and to be a part of things. And basically what we're doing, I could give them a great long introduction, but it won't take long for you to listen to them that you'll know that, man, God loves them and God has anointed them and He's deposited a lot in them. And the reason that basically I asked them to come and do this is because we're in a crisis situation in our nation. There's a lot of things going on, and I've been having a lot of my partners ask me, so what is your opinion on things like this? I've actually had people that have been partners with me for over a decade that said that they would refuse to be partners with me anymore because I didn't get out and promote Black Lives Matter. So I basically asked them to come, and we are just going to be discussing the riots, the cancel culture, the Black Lives Matter. What is a Christian response to this? How should we be responding in all of these things? And I just really felt like David and E.W. would help me to address these issues better than I could do it on my own. David is a tremendous historian, and he's got graphics here that'll show you things when we go to talking about the history of our nation, the cancel culture, the tearing down of statues and stuff. And E.W., man, I met E.W. probably 2018, I guess.
Right, I think 2 or 3 years ago.
And you came with Tony Perkins, and he only spoke for 5 minutes, and in 5 minutes he had the crowd standing on their feet, cheering, running the aisles. And I've held a number of conferences with E.W., and I tell you, I just love this man and the way that he says things. So anyway, I believe it's going to really be good. But that's kind of the motive behind what we're doing, and so we just need to jump into this. So I guess I'll just say this, that, you know, when George Floyd was killed, and again, it's not my place to say what it is, but it looks like, from my perspective, it was total police brutality and murder. There may be some circumstances I'm not aware of. But anyway, regardless, this just provided an ignition for all of the hatred and so many other things that are done. And people are talking about that this is a freedom movement and Black Lives Matter. And I really believe that there is a sinister, demonic thing behind all of this. It is not what it's meant to be, and so that's what we're going to be discussing and talking about. So E.W., let's start with you. Let's have you kind of get us going on
Well,
this.
first of all, Andrew, it's an honor to be here, an honor to have an opportunity to talk with you, with David, about these important issues. I would say a couple of things to introduce this discussion, particularly on Black Lives Matter. First of all, I've categorically, unequivocally, as an American of African descent, an American whose ancestors were slaves, I've categorically denounced Black Lives Matter because it's not about saving Black lives or anybody else's life. It's actually about trying to pursue a Marxist agenda for the United States of America. It's about trying to fundamentally transform our country. Well, how do we know that? There are a couple of pieces of evidence of that. One piece of evidence is that since the death of George Floyd, there have been over 140 murders related to these protests, so-called, and riots, and many of them young children. Black Lives Matter had nothing to say about any of that. There have been Black officers killed. There have been Black babies killed. One kid, Talaferro, who was lying in bed, 4 years old, lying in bed in his home, killed. Another young girl, 6 years old, with her mother in a car, trying to get around a Black Lives Matter barrier. They shot the car and killed the child. You don't hear anything about this. Not to mention, of course, the 400,000 abortions that take place against Black women in our country every single year, completely disproportionate to the population. So it can't be about that, because the evidence makes clear that they don't have anything to say about that. You know, I've often said it this way. You've got to step over a lot of dead black bodies to get to the one that you can use for political purposes.
Yeah.
And they ignore all the others so that they can get that one. And yet we know, and we'll, I'm sure, discuss this, that the number of black people actually allegedly unjustly killed by police, based upon some evidence, is minuscule compared to the number of arrests, compared to the number of interactions that black people have with police officers. So it's a political ploy. I mean, so that's clearly part of it. I mean, the other part of it is, if you look at their website, it's clear they've got a Marxist agenda. Anti-Christian, anti-family. What is the one thing the black community needs more than anything else in the world right now? It needs the family rebuilt and strengthened so that these young kids that are running our streets will have a father in their lives to give them guidance and instruction. And yet Black Lives Matter website says they want to do away with the nuclear family. Yep. They want to promote transgenderism.
That's off of their own website.
On their own website. So even the website, and of course Patrisse Cullors, who was one of the founders, says we are trained Marxists.
Yeah.
And so it's clear that their real agenda is not saving black lives.
And when she said that about being trained Marxists, it was in response to a question about, is this just spontaneous? Are people, just doing this? And she said, no, we are trained Marxists. In other words, we know exactly what we're doing.
Christians, particularly, black, white, Hispanic, whatever, should understand this for what it is. This is nothing but a ruse of the devil using race to get people emotionally stirred up for another agenda that is distinctly anti-Christian. And that's why I've said, so when people ask me about it, I say, look, I have denounced it. Do Black Lives Matter? All lives matter. And therefore, of course, Black Lives Matter.
But if a white man says all lives matter, they say that all lives don't matter until Black Lives matter.
Well,
that's one of the reasons I wanted you to come on, because you can get by with saying things that
the biblical case is exactly the opposite, isn't it? All lives matter,
right.
And therefore, regardless of the ethnic background of the person, their lives matter.
Let me just interrupt for a second and say that I don't think there's a single one of us that are saying that every person involved in these protests and riots or Black Lives Matter or have a bad agenda or something. Right. Some of them are sincere, but we believe that they are being manipulated and controlled. And if you look at the root, those three women that started Black Lives Matter, I mean, they are against just about everything that Christianity stands for. They are very strong LGBTQ.
Yep.
They are against having blacks in jail until the age of 23. They are against all the police things, and on you could go. I mean,
they're against America, frankly. They're against America.
Well, when you look at this thing, as a white guy is a black guy. I don't think anybody in America, I have not heard anybody justify what happened to George Floyd.
Right.
No.
Straight across the board. This has nothing to do with George Floyd or what happened there, or that was just for not. Everybody's condemned it. I don't know of anybody who hasn't condemned it. This is a different discussion. And for me, I am a white guy who is also an American, Texan. I don't know, maybe that's more important than American. Because Texan, but for me, the priority of stuff is not American or white, it is biblical, and biblical more than Christian. Because there's a lot of folks who claim to be Christian who are not biblical in their thinking. And so what I strive for is to be biblical in thinking, and with that, I believe you should embrace truth wherever you find it. You just embrace truth because Jesus says, I am the way, the truth. If you found truth, that's where Jesus lives. And so one of the things I think is really important to say up front is the biblical view on race is what we find in Acts 17:26. Out of one man, he made all races of men. So from the scientific standpoint, about 10 years ago, they did a study, but it's been covered really well by National Geographic and Smithsonian, all these other groups. And the DNA right now, there are only 4 DNA races in the world. There's about 30,000 ethnicities, only 4 DNA races. And DNA race, there's the Anglo, there's the Negro race, there's the Australian race. They've got 4 different races. Everybody else is an ethnicity. But when it comes to DNA, E.W. and myself, black guy and a white guy, we have more DNA in common than any 2 identical twins born in nature to the same mama. So even though we have different families, our DNA is closer, scientifically, if all the secular guys agree, we have closer DNA than if you take identical twin giraffes born to the same mama. They have less DNA connection than we do. So from a DNA standpoint, we only have very small superficial differences. So quite literally, if we all come from Adam, you and I are 150th cousins. I don't know what else we got back there, but we're at least 150th cousins. And that's why we're told in 1 Samuel 17:26 that God does not look on the outside, he looks at the inside. And so any movement that's going to focus on the outside more than it focuses on the inside is not going to be biblical.
Amen.
And I'll just put that up front. From a biblical race perspective, God is not looking at what's out here, he's looking at what's in here.
And one of the things I love about E.W., you spoke at one of my conferences, and you were making the point that if you could just wave your hand and make everybody the same color, then they'd start.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
He said if God waved his hand over the whole earth, made everybody the same complexion, same texture hair, and he left one difference, some green eyes, some brown eyes, some blue eyes, some hazel eyes, it wouldn't be long before over in a corner would be the hazel-eyed people saying,
That's
"Did
right.
you see the way those green-eyed people were looking at us?"
Yeah.
You know,
That's exactly
because it's the spirit of division,
Yeah, it is.
really,
It
isn't
is.
it? So people will use any excuse to create.
And so the black and white race issue is really, it's just evil. And they're using that, and especially the Marxists. I believe that you were saying earlier that class warfare doesn't work that well in America, so they use race.
Yeah, because we're an upwardly mobile society. I mean, and probably all of us. I know me, born into a broken home, poverty, raised in foster care. My wife and I have experienced a wonderful life, and we know that anybody in this country who wants to make something of themselves, the opportunity is there. I mean, we're proof positive of it.
Well, you need to let them know a little bit. You've graduated from Harvard.
Right?
You're a lawyer, and yet you were raised in poverty, foster care.
Sure. My father had a 6th grade education. He was a 3rd-class welder, and yet he raised a son, was able to graduate. I served in the Marine Corps, graduated from college, summa cum laude. Went on to Harvard Law School, graduated from Harvard Law School, practiced law for about 17 years.
But you're an oppressed minority.
But I haven't felt it, you know? I mean, and let's face it, propagandizing and brainwashing people and telling them, oh, you're a victim, you're a victim, you're a victim, is what's helping to stoke these protests and riots and all of the disorder that's happening around our country, as opposed to telling people, look, if you really want to consider, of all the places in the world you could have been born, you hit the lottery because you've got more opportunity to fulfill your God-given potential here than any place else in the world. And we know that that's true, but the intelligentsia won't tell.
Part of the only way this works is if you look at what you want the narrative to be and ignore the truth everywhere else. So if you look at the narrative of how bad it is in America and ignore the rest of the world, then make an argument.
Yeah.
But you have to ignore the rest of the world. Census Bureau statistics right now tell us that if you live in poverty in America, and we don't want anybody in America in poverty. This is not a defense of poverty, but if you do live in poverty in America, according to Census Bureau statistics right now, if you're in poverty in America, you have more square footage of living space, you have more food, you have more computers and technology, you have more of everything than the second richest place in the world, which is Western Europe. So if you're in poverty in America, your lifestyle is higher than the middle class in Western Europe. Now, the only way you can say being in America is being oppressed is if you don't look at the rest of the world. But when you take the worst condition in America, and that's higher than Western Europe, that's not the thing we're being told. You know, we're supposed to feel really bad, and we do feel bad for those that don't have it right, but it's not a matter of this group. Again, it's not the superficial outside stuff, it's inside stuff.
And you can take that same principle and say that this is what all of these riots and Black Lives Matter is doing. They are focusing on the exceptions of police brutality. And nobody here is saying that there isn't racism.
That's right.
And that there aren't people that hate other people of different races. But they are focusing focusing on, like, when it comes to the police, the exceptions to the rule. How many policemen? 800,000 policemen, I think.
800,000. Yep.
And we have how many cases of police brutality? I mean,
well, what they've documented, and there's several studies, but they all come to about the same number. As far as unarmed blacks who were shot last year, there were 9 shot by police last year. Of the 9, 6 were involved in a felony at the time they were shot and were fleeing the police or arrest or whatever. 3 were just unarmed shootings. And so there's 3, and that's 3 too many. But that is not systemic.
No.
And that is not, I mean, when you have 330 million Americans, you're going to have people really screwed up.
Of course.
And they're going to get it wrong. And so one of the things that I'll ask any group, and I get the same answer every time, do you believe racism is a sin? Yes. If it's a sin, it applies to everybody. You don't just have white sins and red sins and black sins. You get sins because it's human nature. So if racism is a sin, it's with everyone. It's interesting that at Harvard University, Professor Roland Fryer, an economist there, did a study, blew him away, because when this started a few years ago with Ferguson and other stuff, he started looking at shootings by police departments, killings of unarmed blacks, etc. And he said he studied the 10 largest police departments in America, and they were urban police departments, so 10 largest urban police departments. He said that a white man, an unarmed white man, was 20% more likely to be shot by police than an unarmed black man.
Yeah.
But nobody's pointing out, but that's a stat that he said is the most shocking thing of his life. He did not expect to find that, and that's what he found. And he went to Houston and LA and all the big police departments. I mean, it does happen, but it happens anywhere you've got people. You're going to have mistakes, and they're going to make mistakes with Hispanics, with whites, with blacks, with because we're humans, and those police aren't saying, oh, you're... Now, granted, there's no question that there are more blacks that are incarcerated than whites, but that's not necessarily a matter of race. That is, statistically speaking, that is more of a function of family condition. If you're born outside of a marriage with a mom and a dad, you're more likely to end up in jail and commit crimes. And so whites are seeing that number go up in their community right now because 72%, I think you said, of black children are born in a home without a mother and a father. They're more likely to end in jail, not because they're black, but because they don't have a mother and a father. And whites escalating really rapidly right now, same with Asians, same with Hispanic. Every group where you're having less moms and dads, children born into families with moms and dads, you're seeing the crime rate go up. So while there is a lot more black incarceration, it's not necessarily because you're black, it's because you come out of a situation where you don't have a mom and dad, you're more likely to end in jail, and that's another thing to be considered. You just got to look at that.
It's a higher incidence of violent crime in the inner cities, and remember, it's black people who are the higher victims too. I mean, they're the ones who are dying at the hands.
I think it's the blacks who are going to suffer the most if they defund the police departments, because that's where a lot of the crime's taking place.
You know, one of the things that bothers me and frustrates me about this whole thing is that often the people who are the loudest in stoking the resentment are the people who have done so well in our country. I mean, when you get people like LeBron James and Oprah Winfrey and Spike Lee and Dr. Dre, who's a convicted felon, still gangster rapper, and billionaire, saying this is a terrible country, and well, you know, I'm thinking, wait a minute, if you, a black former felon and a black gangster rapper, can become a billionaire, how can you then stand up and say, see, you can't make it in America, it's a nation of white supremacy? And of course, much of that gangster rap was directed against white people, and yet you have succeeded tremendously beyond what most people experience. Why don't we tell that narrative? Why don't we tell the narrative of all the people in the black community and elsewhere as well who start from nowhere and become tremendously successful, frankly, more successful than they would have been anywhere else in the world.
That's right. Anywhere else in the world.
And that's the story that needs to be told. I mean, Oprah Winfrey is doing a program on white guilt, and she's walking people through discovering their racism and how you've got to confess it. You may not have known you were a racist, but
confess what you don't even know that you've done.
But now you are. I mean, so this stuff is not. I say the future of our country is in all of us coming together as Americans to make our country the very best nation we can be, not ripping each other apart, and certainly not you're right. It's the sin. Now we've got the sin of categorizing a whole group of people, namely, quote unquote, white people, as somehow inherently evil, immoral, racist.
And I am, whether I know it or not.
Whether you know it or not, or whether you've done anything specifically or not. I mean,
and even if you've done something opposite to the narrative, you're still a racist.
Right, exactly.
It doesn't matter how much you go.
And if you hadn't done anything, then you apologize for your ancestors that were in the Civil War.
Well, this is the crazy thing. I mean, going back to the Bible warns us about having a root of bitterness whereby men are defiled.
It does.
And when you're going to work on being offended, and you're going to find something to be offended about, and you're going to keep digging and digging and digging until you get offended, the Bible says it will defile men. It's a root of bitterness whereby men are defiled. And so the biblical narrative is, okay, you're unjustly in jail, your name is Joseph. It's not about being bitter over what's happened. It's about seeing where God's going to put you and what you're going to do with it.
Amen.
Or your name is Job, and what happened to you? Well, it's not about what happened to you. It's about what you're going to do to overcome what happened. And so the focus, as long as you're going to be focused on something negative, it will be counterproductive. It is not going to heal the nation you think you want healed. What you're going to do is create a civil war kind of thing because you're polarizing people. And a lot of people say, hey, I'm with you, but don't call me a racist because I've done exactly opposite in my life. And so especially what's happening with academia right now and the white privilege. And your privilege, whether you realize it or not, no. Some people worked really, really hard. And it's not a matter of privilege. And you know, as you said, even with a black billionaire, what are you upset about?
Right.
You know? People just don't buy that. And so the more you focus on something small, the more illogical your conclusions are and the more people reject that. And that's where they're in danger of losing a lot of support right now because they've gone a lot further. You know, statues is a good example. They're not tearing down racist statues, they're just tearing down statues. It started with Confederate statues. It hadn't stopped there.
That's right.
It's going after everything, and now people are saying, no, that's not what you told me when this started.
Yeah, well, let me go back to police brutality, which is kind of what started all of these riots and everything like that. I looked up something in March just on Siri. I asked Siri, and they said that there were 77 whites that had been killed by police at that time this year, and there was 38 or 36 blacks. And when you consider, and you guys will know the figures better than I do, but when you consider that the majority of felonies and stuff are committed by blacks, then that's actually disproportionate. There's a disproportional amount of whites that are being killed by the police compared to blacks.
this is the thing that you're not allowed to say, that 52%, I believe the number is, of murders committed in the country are committed by 6% of the population, which is namely young black men.
And they're committed against other black
And they're
men.
primarily, 94% of those murders are against other young black men primarily. And that's the real explanation for why there's so much negative interaction between police and the black community. But you know, as I've said before, and nobody wants to, particularly these so-called black leaders, they don't want to hear this. How about we start teaching these kids that the police don't hate them and to not see them as an enemy? You know, I said, because, you know, I do a radio program on American Family Radio, and I said on my radio program one time, I'm 68 years old. I've never, ever had a bad interaction with a police officer. Now, some are more friendly than others. Some, you know, almost joke with you and are really friendly and nice. But I've never had a police officer call me out of my name, put his hands on me, mistreat me in any way. I said, well, how is it that all the time I've been in the world, somehow this hunting down of black men has missed me? And I had a guy contact me and say, you shouldn't say that. Well, I said, but it's the truth. Yeah, but when you say that, you give the police carte blanche to commit, you know? And so you can't win. I believe there are a lot of people like me out there, but the narrative is, the lying narrative is, police are out hunting down black men, they're out to get black men. And so I say, if you say, one reporter from MSNBC actually said that, I think it was Rayshard Brooks, actually said he fought because he knew that if he didn't fight, they would kill him. That's what you're telling young black guys? Fight the cops? That outcome can't go well. What we need to be saying is treat the police with respect.
You know, a very good friend of mine who's black and well known, he gave as an example of prejudice among police that he got stopped for a traffic violation, and as the guy was walking to the car, he had his hand on his gun, and he said it was because he was a black man. But you know what? That same thing happened to me, and I'm white. So what I'm saying is, there is no doubt that there is racism, and
It's a
I
human
wasn't personally raised around it, but you know, I've got a friend like Creflo Dollar and some other people in Atlanta that, I mean, there were the Jim Crow laws.
That's right.
There were terrible things being done. And I can understand how a black man could have a chip on his shoulder, but it's being manipulated. That fear that somehow or another there's systemic racism is being fanned and amplified much more than I believe it's justified.
Well, especially when you look since Jim Crow days, because I have several friends who are NFL football players, black guys, and they can go through the stories of what people tried to do because they were black, including teammates, white teammates. And the racism was there. No question it was, especially if you're in the South. But also we're looking, we kind of wiped out the Jim Crow laws about 60 years ago. You know, the civil rights movement was very successful. So what is it that we're focusing on now? We have to go back to really ancient past, or we have to take an isolated incident and make it seem like it's the norm, because you're not looking at Jim Crow laws today. I mean, when 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act was signed, that ended Jim Crow, and now the enforcement has been aggressive on the other side. And so, yeah, there's still going to be, but you know what? If you want to look at incidental stuff, the only people that have ever tried to kill me in my life are black people. So what do I form? I form a conclusion that all blacks are. No, that's not it. That's who I had some interaction with, and just because that does not mean you stereotype a whole group. And same with police or anything else. And so starting to be able to and again, as a Christian, God is I'm going to use the example of Job. What happened to Job, no way, shape, fashion, or form was fair. Job lost everything. He lost his kids. He lost everything. But it was not about what happened to Job. It was about how Job was going to respond to what happened to him. And because Job responded right, God blessed him and prospered him. He got twice as much. So the test was, now Job didn't know what was going on, but Satan and God are talking, and God says, hey, Satan, watch this. You do it to him, he's going to respond right. No, he won't. And it was all about the response. And that's really what God's looking for from His people, not for them to go get offended and pick up somebody else's offense. If there's something that's unjust, you fight that. But right now, we're not checking our reactions. So, you know, people tell you, because you won't stand up for Black Lives Matter, we're going to stop funding you. No, you better check with God on that. You better make sure you know what's happening with that, because right now you're buying into a narrative. And you know, and I'm going to jump into something different here, but this narrative, if America, and we're told that it's systemically racist, the 1619 Project tells us that America's constitutional system was built on racism, and therefore the constitutional system needs to go.
Right before we get there, I know where you're headed,
Yep.
and I want you to come back to that. But let me say that when you go to saying this, and I go to saying, it's the reason we love to have E.W. here with us, but when we go to talking about this, people say, but you don't know what it's like. You have never had any prejudiced against you. You've never been treated bad. And let me just say real quickly, when I was drafted, it was during 1969, and we had race riots in my barracks. I am the only white guy that did not go to the infirmary. Every person was beat up except me, and that's because the guy who headed it up, I had witnessed to him. And when he came to me, God convicted him. His dad was a Baptist pastor, and I'm the only white guy out of my whole thing that didn't get beat up, and it was because of my witness for the Lord. And in the quadrangle right next to us, they had a race riot, and they took a white guy, and while he was asleep, they killed him with an entrenching tool and beat his face in and stuff. So I have had things come against me, but I don't harbor any hard feeling against blacks. Those were individuals. It wasn't the color of their skin that caused that.
You know, I was in Milwaukee because I did a little tour when these riots. Remember, we had this happening 5 or 6 years ago, where we had a series of riots, and we had 5 police officers assassinated in Dallas. And I was in Milwaukee right after the riots there, where they once again attacked the police station. And I had an old black guy come up to me and say, I was here 50 years ago. He said, I can't believe that we're having the same problems 50 years later.
Yeah.
You know what I said to him? I said, and if we don't do something differently, we're going to have the same problems 50 years from now.
That's right.
And the people who are stoking this stuff, they don't want solutions.
No.
They don't want to see the lives of black people better. They don't want to see America be better. They want to use this as an opportunity to change this country. And here again, somebody who grew up in the ghetto, grew up in poverty, what we need to tell kids is get an education.
Yeah.
Get married before you have children. Be faithful to your wife and your husband.
That's right.
Work hard in life. Treat people decently. What I wanted to come to, Andrew, is this. My father was black, and he didn't raise me with one sense of, son, they won't let you do anything. You got a right to be angry and bitter. My father used to say to me, son, this is the greatest nation on earth. Will there be opposition to what you want to do in life? Sure. But if you are determined, nobody can stop you.
That's right.
Not only did he say that, he said, and by the way, help will come from unexpected places. If people see that you want to do something with your life, that's the message we've got to get out to these kids so that they realize, wait a minute, I've got great opportunities here, rather than go burn down the federal building, go attack people because nobody will let you do anything. I mean, it's a lie, and it's going to perpetuate itself until, you mentioned civil war, until at some point you're going to have people fighting in the streets just to survive.
We saw even this week that Black Lives Matter is announced that they have now brought in special forces folks to teach them how to have a military to fight the police, that they're creating fighting forces to go fight the police, because they're already saying, hey, we don't want any arrests until you're 23 or whatever. And by the way, like Minneapolis and others, we don't want police departments. We want them gone. But we're creating our own special forces to go attack the police. So they're escalating this thing. And a lot of people feeling guilty about being white or anything else, want to give lots of space and lots of ground. And what they're doing is giving up ground that it's not going to be what they want. Because as you pointed out, they are trained Marxists. And what Marxists want is turmoil. But you can't just go in and say, let's blow up the nation. You got to go in and get people offended over something that they'll get offended over, and then you can blow up the nation. So it's like the magician. Watch my hand. It's racism. No, it's not. Over here, I'm going to blow everything up. and they're watching the wrong hand. And so that's a lot of what's going on. And that's, again, why we've seen this thing move from where it has. And even the narrative. When I listen to the news, I would think that the black community is all unified on getting rid of police, until I see the national polling that says by far the group that least wants to get rid of police is the black community. Now that doesn't fit the narrative we're being told, and so therefore we don't hear much about that poll. You have to look for it, and it's out there, and there's several like that. But media's not covering that because that doesn't help their narrative and their story.
And this is kind of like a perfect storm, because if the media wasn't just amplifying all the stuff that they're doing, they wouldn't be able to do this. But we got all these different dynamics working.
And I'm sorry.
This is the first time I'd ever heard you say that about your dad, but I would relate that attitude he instilled in you is one of the reasons that you're a Harvard graduate and that you're prosperous.
Yep.
And Tony Dungy, James Brown are friends of mine, and both of them have said very similar things. Tony Dungy specifically talked about his dad being sent to the back of the bus, and rather than be humiliated, he just decided he'd walk every day. But he didn't instill in Tony this attitude that you're underprivileged and you're being treated bad. He said there's always a way to respond. And as a result, Tony Dungy's at the top of his game, and his dad rode on the bus to the White House and sat on the front seat with him and stuff because they didn't have this victim mentality.
Well, all the stuff you were saying, you got from your dad, and all the stuff you're saying, get an education and get married and have children in marriage and love your husband and wife, be faithful. That should be said to every kid in America, regardless of what race they are. And what your dad said, hey, if you'll go after it, there'll be people surprised that people come alongside to help. Every kid should believe that. Every kid should be taught that. It doesn't matter what color they are, what background they are. That's the key to success, and that's universal. And
let me add to that you should teach every kid that they ought to love God and let the Word of God be the foundation. Because you were talking about that you have to have this root of bitterness to be able to protest and kill and justify burning buildings and defacing things. You have to not love your neighbor as yourself, to go do to somebody else what you would never want done to you. And so it's certainly all of those things about family and everything else, but people have lost their fear of God is what's wrong.
And Andrew, let me also say this, because this is the other thing that Father instilled in me, and I found it to be true. I get emotional even talking about it, there is an immense amount of goodwill among the American people.
There are.
The American people want to do what's right. Do we have idiots in our country? Yeah.
You bet.
Of course we do.
We got humans in our country. We got
Look at the news.
But we've got such goodwill among the people of this country. And if we would begin to instill in our young people that we're a Judeo-Christian nation, people who want to do good to others. I mean, look, we're the most charitable nation the world has ever known. When there's a disaster somewhere in the world, no people, I'm not just talking about our government, no people give more than the American people give to help people all around the world and to help people in our own country. And here again, we ought to be instilling that, giving them a reason to be proud of and grateful for our country rather than a reason to be resentful and angry and hateful toward it.
So let me go back to where you were headed a minute ago. One of the reasons that there's so many, I believe, sincere people who've been sucked into this thing without knowing it is because they have been taught a wrong history of our nation. You were telling me that there was some elected politician that actually said that slavery was invented or started.
Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia. He
U.S.
said,
Senator,
right.
America didn't, his quote, America did not inherit slavery, America started
Invented
slavery.
it. That's right.
That
We
is so
invented it.
stupid. You gotta be dumb to believe that. So, David, give us a little bit of history here. This is your expertise.
Okay, if racism is a sin, then it applies to all people. So if it applies to all people, when you look back in history, Rwanda, what we saw in Rwanda 10 years ago was 3 black groups killing each other because they weren't the wrong, it's like the hazel eyes, the blue eyes, and the green eyes.
Wrong tribe.
So you had the wrong tribe. That was not white. That was racism. It was black on black racism, but it was racism because you're the wrong race, you're the wrong black race, you're the wrong black ethnicity. You know, again, not race, but ethnicity. So when you take it, people are surprised to see things like this. Andrew, I'll just put those in front of you.
All right.
And it's called The White Slavery, Horrors of the Traffic, and White Slavery. So there's 2 big pamphlets because it turns out that in 16th century America there were more white slaves than there were black slaves. Now, I will guarantee you nobody's heard that, but there's documentation on it. It has the numbers, has where it happened, where the trafficking was.
Do you know those numbers, percentage?
Well, there were 1.25 million white slaves taken by Muslims, and many of them taken out of America. So particularly white slaves were being trafficked by Muslims around the Mediterranean Sea.
So part of the Barbary Pirate Wars were Americans trying to
We had
free
32
white
years.
slaves.
America's fought a war for 32 years from 1784 to 1816, in which we dispatched military troops to go free white slaves that were being imprisoned by Muslims. Now, there were also black slaves, and we went and freed slaves we could in Europe. There were actually 9 nations that joined together to fight the Muslim trade, but the white trade was bigger then. By the way, the first pro-slavery law in America, 1671, and it allowed you to hold black slaves, white slaves, or Indian slaves. You could hold any race for slave. That was your first slave law.
Slavery was the problem,
Slavery
not
was the problem.
race.
It was not race. As a matter of fact, this man right here, this is a great historian. This guy right here is Carter Woodson. This is the Journal of Negro History. He was a professor back in the 1920s. He's the guy who gave us Black History Month. This is a piece that he did back in 1930. And this piece right here is called Free Negro Owners of Slaves in the United States in 1830. He checked the 1830 census and found that free blacks in South Carolina, 43% of free blacks owned black slaves. Now,
So black on black slavery.
on black, and 43%. And then when you go to Louisiana, 40% of free blacks in Louisiana own black slaves. So black on black slavery was a big deal in America.
So it's not just white on black, it was just
In other
evil
words,
slavery.
it's not the skin,
That's
it's
right.
the sin.
It's the heart. That's right.
Yeah.
This is an ad for the this is 1826 Chickasaw Indian Agency, and they're looking for runaway black slaves. And as it turns out, by the 1860 census, the 5 large Native American tribes in America were the highest percentage of black slave owners of any group in America. White Americans, 8% owned slaves, but what you had 12% of Native American tribes owned slaves, or 12% of the
David,
population.
You just went through that so quick. You're saying 8% of whites
92%,
owned slaves?
92% of Americans never owned slaves. So you have 8% that are the slave owners.
Now, this doesn't fit the narrative.
It does
of
not
the
fit
Black
the narrative.
Lives Matter.
No,
This
it does not fit the
America
narrative.
is just, it was founded on racism. It's all slavery.
Well, if you're looking for restitution, are you going to go to the black slave owners? Are you going to go to the white slave owners who owned white slaves? Are you going to the Arabic slave owners who owned white slaves? Are you going to the Native American slave owners who not only owned black slaves, they owned Native American slaves? Where do you stop? Because this is a problem.
I think I heard you say that there was actually a higher percentage, population-wise, among Indians that owned slaves than there was
In the
whites.
1860 census, while 8% of Americans owned slaves, or 8% of Americans were 8% of
White.
Now, let's say it differently. 8% of the population was slaves in the general population. Among the Native American populations, 12% were slaves. So among the general population in America, it was 8%. Among Native Americans, it was 50% higher. It was 12% instead of 8%. So, and by the way, people blame Columbus for slavery. When Columbus arrived in the New World, anthropologists tell us that between 20 and 40% of Native Americans were enslaved by other Native Americans at the time Columbus landed here. So Native American slavery, and by the way, when we ended slavery with the 13th Amendment in 1865, that did not apply to Indian tribes because they're their own nations. Slavery continued in Indian tribes after we abolished slavery in the 13th Amendment, 1865.
And the things you're saying are just ruining the narrative for everybody.
But that's it. If truth matters, if this is not about an agenda, if this is about what's true, then you have to embrace truth wherever you find it. And whether it be from black historians who were very candid about what happened in their own race, whether it be from Native Americans, and by the way, these are all little cards that came out of the 1860s. These are all of white slaves in Louisiana. So white slavery was part of black slavery as well. Again, it's a sin problem.
They had white slaves.
They had white slaves in Louisiana. And these are, they had a whole series of cards of slaves. There's 3 white slave children. I mean, that was not at all uncommon. It's just that nobody talks about it today, which is why you can create a false narrative to create an end that doesn't justify what history shows.
So let me just have you amplify on this a little bit more. But if I understand things correctly, many of the people that came to the States came as indentured servants, which was a form of slavery, but just for 7 years or something, then they got their freedom.
Including the first blacks who arrived.
Yeah. So what happens is the 1619 Project, New York Times, they gave themselves a Pulitzer Prize for that. Imagine that. They think that's a great idea. So many of the historians, secular historians, part of that have pulled out of it, said this is bad history. This is wrong narrative. You have an agenda. This is not about history. And so a lot of them that they originally brought in to consult have said this is wrong, and they've pulled out, and the New York Times is still going forward. It now has curriculum in all 50 states. Schools in all 50 states are using 1619 curriculum. And they choose 1619 because they say that's when slavery got started in America. Well, interestingly, the start of slavery in America, in 1619, there was a Portuguese slave ship that was captured off the coast of Virginia. And those slaves were brought on the coast of Virginia. So they were slaves, they were brought there, but they weren't being brought there, they were captured. And when they were captured, it's interesting. You mentioned indentured servant. It's like we've got these private companies now that are willing to take you to the moon or Mars or whatever, and going to cost $500,000. Well, I don't have that, but I think my labor is worth $50,000 a year, so I'll work for you 10 years if you'll let me have a trip to the moon. That's indentured servant. I'm using myself as collateral for you to sponsor me to go. It's not slavery. What I'm doing is I have signed a loan, and I'm using myself as the collateral in that.
And that's in the Bible.
And that's in the Bible. And so what you have, and in 7 years, you do that 7 years and it's over, and that's how long the indenture was in Virginia and elsewhere. You came to the New World and said, okay, if I'll sponsor your trip to the New World if you'll work for me 7 years, and then when you finish working for me, I will give you your own piece of property. You get your own land, you get your own property. I'll set you up in business so you can succeed. So what happened is those slaves off the Portuguese slave ship got brought on shore of Virginia, and they weren't made into slaves. They were indentured servants. They worked, and they were all freed by the state, and they all got land from the state. So that 1619 doesn't hold because that's not the start of slavery in America. Now, one of the indentured servants that worked his way into prosperity is a guy named Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson worked his way to prosperity, started sponsoring others indentured servants, and one indentured servant was a black guy, and Anthony went to court and said, this guy is so lazy. He is so bad, I'll never get my money back off this guy. Mr. Court, Mr. Judge, I want you to give me this guy for life because it'll take the rest of his life to pay off what I invested. And the court said, yep, you can have him for life. The first occasion of black slavery in America was a black man going to court only to sue another black man, and that's where slavery gets started in Virginia. And so none of that's in the 1619
And there's some people
project.
that are just really getting set free, but there's others that are getting mad because they already believe this, and that doesn't fit the narrative.
Well, you know, the other thing that I find very intriguing about that early period is, you know, this whole concept of whiteness. You know, people in the 16th, 17th century didn't think of themselves as white. They thought of themselves as Irish or Italian or wherever they came from. And in my view, it was after Bacon's Rebellion and the willingness of poor, less privileged whites to come together with blacks who were indentured servants or maybe slaves, to come together, that they said, now wait a minute, we got to put a stop to this. We can't have these people coming together against the elites, because the slave owners in the country were always a minority.
Yeah.
And they said, well, you know, we white people have got to stick together, you know, and no matter how bad it may be for you, in other words, you may be the poorest of the poor, but remember, you're not one of them. And they began this ideology.
That's right.
This ideology of whiteness versus blackness. And instead of people in our country today realizing, no, the fact of the matter is, all of our ancestries are different.
That's right.
In all kinds of ways. I mean, the Northern Italians and the Southern Italians didn't even like each other.
Yeah,
you know?
that's right.
And there were Irish people, the Scotch Irish, and the Irish who came to the potato famine. They didn't even like each other. They didn't see each other as the same people. But now we've got this thing of whiteness, and there's such a thing as white supremacy. Nobody's ancestors came to this country thinking, boy, I'll tell you what, we white people are really going to clean up here. No, they came from their own ethnic background, their own nation, and they were simply trying to pioneer out of life. And most of them never had anything to do with slavery. So,
you know, it just seems like it's inherent in human nature to somehow or another dislike somebody because of something. Like, I was raised in Texas like David, and we used to sit there and talk about people from Oklahoma.
Oh, we still do.
Right.
And I had the
What do you mean used to? We still do.
I had to joke that the Oklahomans would throw dynamite across the Red River at us in Texas, then we'd light it and throw it back. And so, anyway, there's always the Sooners against the Texans and the Yankees against the Confederates, and
or Texas A&M against University of Texas, or, you know, that's what rivalries are. And sometimes they get carried way too far. But
and so anyway, this thing about systemic racism, that America is just systemic racist and that it permeates everything. How would you address that?
Well, see, what happens is I would take you back to what you don't know about American history. Not only that the fact that all races were involved in slavery, I would take you back to the fact that what you've been told for the last 30 years is all about the atrocities that happened in the Deep South, where they had plantation slavery. If I take you into the North and show you that by 1804, there was not a northern state that still had slavery. They had all abolished it. And by the way, they were the first in the world to do so. Now, let me put some context here. America was the first nation in the world to abolish the slave trade, 1807. Now think about that. It's only been 200 years since anybody abolished the slave trade, and we were the first. Now, we signed our law first, the British signed it afterwards, and theirs went into effect sooner than ours did, but theirs didn't go into full effect. Ours said no more slave trade, period, end of story. The British said, well, we're going to phase it in. So British sometimes get credit being the first. Either way, we're within months of each other, but America's the first to absolutely ban it. So imagine that no one had banned the slave trade till 1807.
So explain what you mean by banning the slave trade, because slavery still existed in 1807.
Here's what the slave trade is. The slave trade starts with black-on-black violence in Africa, tribes killing each other. And I kill you because you're the wrong, just like Rwanda. It's the wrong thing. And then the Arabs come to them and say, wait a minute, don't kill those guys, sell them to us. We'll be happy to buy them from you because we've got markets over in the Mediterranean area. And so suddenly, these guys that were killing their enemies said, well, let's not kill them, let's just sell them. And so then you have the Arab slave traders, and the Portuguese and the Spanish are next to get involved in buying people and selling them. Because if you're going to kill them, that we can make we can make money out of this deal. And so then they start having the slave trade. And so what happens is what we call the African slave trade runs from 1501 to 1875. So roughly 374 years, the African slave trade. In that period of time, we have records that about 12.7 million Africans were taken out of Africa, and they were sent all over the world. Sent to Europe, they were sent to Asia, they were sent to Africa, South America, they were sent everywhere.
Islands. Yeah.
Islands. And so of that 12.7 million that were sent out, 2 million died en route. So 10.5 million made it to their destination. So of that 10.5 million, where did they go? 46% of all slaves sent out of Africa went to Brazil and to Portugal, Portuguese holdings. 26% went to British holdings, not America. 15% went to Spanish holdings. 11% went to French holdings, etc. America got 2.4% of the slave trade. Now,
and how does that fit the narrative that America started?
America
slavery?
started it. We're the only ones that ever did it. No, when you look at the slave trade, we were one of the smaller. Now, that does not excuse the 300,000 that came here. That's still wrong. But at the time it was happening, show me any other nation in the world that thought slavery was wrong. And there's not a nation in the world that thought slavery was wrong because they were all engaged in it. So when America stops the slave trade in 1807 and said, we will take no more slaves from Africa, we're taking no more slaves from anywhere here, we're not going to have any more slaves shipped here, we're the first in the world to do that. Now,
so that stopped the importing and I guess exporting of slaves. But
we stopped the exporting. We stopped the exporting in 1794. In 1794, we stopped the exporting. George Washington signed the law, said we will not participate in sending slaves any other nation. We're not going to do it. It's wrong. 1807 is when the Constitution allowed us to sign the law. It did not go into effect until 1808, January 1. So the Constitution said, the southern states said, if you'll give us 20 years, we think we can get rid of slavery. And so from 1787, when they did the Constitution, 20 years later, okay, we gave you 20 years, let's end the slave trade. So that's, now, it's interesting, the first nation to abolish slavery in history was Great Britain in 1833. America was the fourth nation in 1865. Now think of that. There's 124 nations in the world. We're number 4 in the world, and that's only 150 years ago that we were number 4. We're in the top 1% of the world in ending slavery, but that was only 150 years ago. People think that for 5,500 years we've known slavery was wrong. No, we haven't. This is a new thing that's come to pass. And so what happens is when you look at where we are now, did you know that right now 195 nations in the world, in 94 nations they still have not criminalized slavery. Yep. Still legal in 94 nations right now. Now, there's 40 million slaves in the world today as we sit here talking. Wow. So if you're really concerned about slavery, let's talk about 94 nations that haven't done a stinking thing, and let's talk about 40 million that still have. No, we're going to talk about America, and we're going to talk. We were number 1 in the world to end slave trade, number 4 in the world to end slavery, and by the way, those New England states all ended slavery by 1804. They were ahead of anybody in the world. They were a long way ahead of it, and I can show you those states that there were never a time in Massachusetts when blacks could not vote. We have blacks elected to office in 1760s, 1780s, and 90s. We have black heroes throughout the American Revolution. There are so many black heroes. When you look at the Revolution, if you think it's white, you've read a bad history book.
See, this also is not going along with the narrative because they believe it's systemic, that everybody was racist, and yet there's, 11 out of the 13 colonies that were against slavery?
Yes. At the time of the American Revolution, 11 and 13, were willing to tell Great Britain, we're leaving you because we don't want slavery. Because in 1773, you had Connecticut, you had Rhode Island, you had Massachusetts, and you had Pennsylvania. 1773, they passed anti-slavery laws. King George III vetoed every one of them and said, no, you're part of the British Empire. We have slavery. You'll have slavery.
But people will say that George Washington had to have been racist because he had slaves, Thomas Jefferson and stuff. But doesn't that, how does it affect things when you grew up in this? To me, it's similar to people today who grew up since the 1973 Roe versus Wade, and abortion has been on the books, and we've killed 60 million babies, and yet they don't sit there and feel like they are a part of this system because they hadn't fought against it and stuff.
What happens when you look at that system, Virginia is really a strange place in that Virginia had slave laws that looked like the IRS tax code today. If anybody can figure that out, let me know, because I hadn't even found an accountant that can figure out the IRS tax code. But the slave laws were that way in Virginia. And so George Washington was anti-slavery. The slave laws would not let him free his own slaves until Virginia in 1782 passed a one-time exception, said, you know, we think we'll let you free slaves on your death. Washington, when he died, got to free his slaves. After he died, the state came back and said, yeah, that was a bad mistake. We're not going to let that happen. So Jefferson could not free slaves on his death. Jefferson was in debt to the tune of $2.5 million, and if you owed a debt, you could not free your slaves. So Jefferson inherited slaves. Washington inherited slaves starting when he's 11 years old. So he cannot free his slaves until he dies, which he did. Jefferson's not allowed to free his because he's in debt. And you look at these guys and what they did. Jefferson's the one who signed the first law banning the slave trade. Jefferson made sure that Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois came in as anti-slavery states. He recruited ministers to go there and start anti-slavery societies so that we would not have more pro-slavery states. Washington signed the law banning the importation of slaves. Washington signed the federal law saying no new territories can come in the United States if they have slavery. He made sure that slavery could not extend past where it was. These guys did so many anti-slavery things. They did not like slavery, but they live in a system.
It is that Washington, if I'm not mistaken, it was George Mason in Washington that actually petitioned the British government to end slavery before the Revolution, and they were denied.
They were denied, and here's something else. Is George Mason's a slaveholder in Virginia. He's one of 55 guys to write the Constitution. He refused to sign it because the Constitution did not abolish slavery. Now, here's a slave owner who said, well, free your slaves. No, he lives in Virginia. He can't. He wants the Constitution to abolish it. Here's a slave owner who did not sign because it didn't abolish. Well, we would say he's a slave owner. He's a bad guy. No, he's working his tail off to get slavery ended.
And how about Jefferson? He actually, his first draft outlawed
condemned.
slavery.
That's right. And so what happened at the Constitutional Convention, they could not get South Carolina and Georgia to agree to end slavery. The others, yes. They wouldn't.
Declaration was pretty much the same
Declaration,
thing.
same way. Jefferson says we had it in the Declaration to do this, and he said South Carolina and Georgia, they were the two stumbling blocks, and so 11 out of the 13. But what we're going to do today is we're going to teach you all about South Carolina and Georgia history. We're going to make you think it was that way for Massachusetts and for Pennsylvania and for Rhode Island and for Connecticut and New Hampshire. And so what people do is they have an image of what happened in two states, and they think that was the American colonial period, and that's not accurate.
So if what you're saying is true, which I believe it 100%, this narrative that America was founded on racism and its systemic racism is an absolute lie.
And the other thing, of course, is that the laws at that time, if a woman, as some of our founding fathers, married into wealth, and their wives inherited slaves, they could not free their wives slaves because they were called dower slaves.
That's right.
And they had no control over them because those slaves would be passed down to the wife's heirs on her side of the family. But the other thing I want to add to what David said, which is absolutely true, I've verified it myself. I mean, you don't need any other authority when David has spoken because he's got all these original documents from which he takes his information. But from the moment lifetime in slavery started, it was debated in this country.
That's right.
Absolutely.
There's never been a moment in American history when people weren't fighting over the immorality of slavery. I mean, the narrative of the left is America's systemically racist, and all of Americans just agree, yeah, blacks are inferior, keep them in slavery. But the fact of the matter is, I'm convinced that a lot of the racial ideology was developed to shut people up who were objecting. Well, now you know this is what God's plan was for them. Well, no, that's not God's plan. Yeah, well, yes, it kind of is. So from the very beginning, leading all the way up to the Civil War, Americans were fighting over slavery. So to this idea that America is inherently racist, well, then why were all these people surrendering their lives? I often point to Preston Brooks and Charles Sumner. I mean, who had a fight on the floor of the Senate in which Charles Sumner almost got beat to death. So it's just a false narrative. I mean, like everything else, it's more complex than people want to make it. America's a complex country, but remember this, America is a Christian nation.
That's right.
And Christian values have always been the conscience of our country. So there's never been a time when, unlike some countries, like India, for example, with its caste system.
That's right.
And other nations, where there weren't Christians saying, well, wait a minute, this is not right. God can't smile on this. In fact, it was Thomas Jefferson who said, right, I tremble when I think that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever.
And that was over slavery.
It was over
we
slavery.
don't release slaves, God's going to judge us. And that's the other thing that is so significant with this whole thing on race is every time there was forward progress made in America, it was Christians who led the way.
Yeah.
Now, you can point to some Christian guys on the other side who use the Bible to justify slavery, but they're the exception, not the rule. The preacher, the abolition movement, I mean, one of the things that when Charles Sumner, when he took that beating from Preston Brooks on the floor of the Senate, they had just had a petition delivered to the Senate that was signed by 4,000 clergymen, which was 75% of all the clergymen of New England. So 75% of all the preachers signed onto an abolition petition saying you got to end slavery. I don't think we can get 75% of Christian ministers to sign on to John 3:16 today, but back then they're willing to stick their name out. So it was always Christian principles that led the right direction, and to blame Christianity for it, yeah, you're going to have some goofed up people who think wrong, but they're the exception, not the rule.
So if a person wants to go back and find some of the founding fathers that were racist or believed in slavery,
let me tell you,
they can find something.
About a fourth of them are. Of all the ones we've investigated, and we have their writings, of the founding fathers, about a fourth were pro-slavery. And there's just no reason for that, no excuse for it.
And those 2 colonies that refused
And that's most
to go
of them right
for
there.
it and stuff, that's 2 out of 13. But that totally changes the narrative.
That's right.
And if that history was known, they wouldn't be able to incite the riot and stuff.
They could not get people to believe their lie if we knew the truth.
And so this leads us to talking about the cancel culture and all of the statues that are being taken down and stuff. How do you respond to all of that?
Let me take you through several slides. So these are all from news services. And so since we're doing educational stuff, we can show these slides. I don't have credit on there for all the different news sources that have them, but people can find them. But we're told that the statues are coming down because of racism and Confederate statues, et cetera. And so as you look at that, and one of the things that I found interesting is I recently went online to see if I could find, because I'm keeping up with what's being torn down, but I want to see if I could find a list of what other sources say are the monuments that are being defaced and statues being torn down. And the top 2 that come up, the big ones, the only thing they have listed are Confederate statues. Oh, okay. And let's just say for the point of discussion that all Confederate statues are bad. But that's not as simple as it is either. There's a lot more to that. But let's just say that. Let's give them that. Then why aren't you putting all the other statues up that are getting torn down? Why are you only showing Confederate statues as if you're trying to justify the point that this is only about race? So let me just go through some real quick. It's, from my standpoint, it's more about hating America. The one that's coming up here is you see a statue done on a painting of Lincoln back in 1863. Lincoln is known as the Great Emancipator. The Emancipation Proclamation 1863 freed slaves in the southern states. And so after the war was over, a number of freed slaves gathered money to build a monument to Lincoln. Frederick Douglass spoke at the commemoration of it. They have one in Boston, which was the hotbed of abolition activities where all these Christian ministers were. And they also have one in D.C. Well, now the Boston mayor is saying, well, we're taking down the one. President Trump has said, we're not taking down the one in D.C. They tried to deface it. He actually had them stop before they could tear it down. But the mayor of Boston said, well, it is coming down. So that's going down. The guy who ended slavery somehow is a racist, and he's got to come down.
Is that because they showed the black man kneeling and kissing his hand?
Well, you can argue that. It shows them in subjugation, but you can also argue that historically they were grateful to Lincoln for having freed them, and that's exactly what happened, which is why the painting was done, because that's what they saw.
If they really believed
that incident actually took place.
That incident happened.
It's history.
It took place. It's history.
And if they really believed that Black Lives mattered, they would do that to show the gratitude towards the person that led the emancipation.
And the Black Lives that mattered at that point, that was their attitude toward Lincoln. They called him the great savior.
Yep.
Again, ignorance. My people perish for
ignorance.
lack of knowledge, and there's people sucked up into this Black Lives Matter that are actually destroying people that were for.
Well, this is a statue out of Cleveland, and this one in Cleveland, these are the Union soldiers and sailors. Now, that's not Confederate. I thought the Union, if we're going to say the Confederate was racist, then we're going to say the Union was fighting racism. So why did you deface the Union soldiers and the Union sailors? And then if you look at David Farragut, he was a Southerner who came to the North to fight slavery. He joined on the side of the Union because he did not agree with slavery, but we've had to tear his statue up and tear it down in D.C. because he's an anti-slavery guy. If you go past Farragut, then you get Ulysses S. Grant. He's the commander-in-chief of the forces that destroyed the Confederacy. What's your issue with him? And by the way, he did, I think, 7 civil rights laws, including the law that punished the Klan for racial violence, and you're going to tear his statue down?
Pretty much destroyed the Klan.
Plus, he freed a slave that was given to him.
Yeah, his wife, who was a Democrat and had a family plantation, gave him the slave. He said, no. Lasted within a week, the slave was freed. So
let's tear his statue down.
Let's tear his statue down because he freed a slave one time. Well, the 54th Math is another one. This is a black unit in the Civil War that was the breakthrough unit for equality. As a result of what they did in the Civil War, I actually owned the bill passed in the Senate that gave blacks and whites equal pay in the military, and that goes back to the Mass 54th. This was one of the units that Frederick Douglass helped recruit, the Mass 54th, Mass 55th. If you watch the movie Glory, that's what this is about. And so we're going to deface their monument, their statue, the Breakthrough Equality Group. If you go to Frederick Douglass statue,
why would you tear that down?
What? Well, we're tearing down racist. Oh, no, wait a minute. See, none of these statues I'm showing you have anything to do with the racist narrative. This has to do with hating America.
Yep.
Anybody
That's
that we
what it's
honor
about.
and recognize in America has to come down, including Frederick Douglass, all the founding fathers. So if you're Caesar Rodney, who freed slaves, he's got to come down. George Washington, of course, we talked about his position and what he did in helping end slavery early on. Then you got
If I'm not
Jefferson.
mistaken, I think I heard you say that among blacks that they had pictures of George Washington hanging up and things like this. He was considered a hero.
Well, he freed his slaves, and for the next several generations, they came and took care of Mount Vernon, took care of the estate, just out of their admiration for him. We have books written by black historians. Great guy is William Nell. William Nell is the first black man to have any position in federal government. And in 1852 and 1855, he did 2 books on black history. And it talks about George Washington and his relationship with black soldiers and how he treated them as equals, would not let them be treated as slaves in the military. And in the military, the positions he had with them. And so even though he owned slaves, his relationship with them was one of equality. And so that's black historians telling us that. The slaves that he freed recognized that and honored him. So, you know, their attitude.
You could say that the blacks today who are so upset and rioting and doing things are totally out of sync with
true history.
With their true history and their own heritage.
That's right.
And let's not forget, he had a famous meeting with Phyllis Wheatley.
That's right.
And she was at that time a black slave.
That's right.
And he had nothing but effusive things to say about her intelligence, about her talent. And he even met with her.
He did the first USO show, and Phyllis Wheatley was the performer. When he was at Cambridge, when they did the Siege of Boston, Phyllis wrote a poem not only about George Whitefield, but about him and others. And he got it, he loved it, and he said, I want you to come perform your poetry for all my officers. He said, but I'm really scared that if I ask you to come, people are going to think that I asked you because you wrote a poem about me, and they'll think I'm being selfish.
Right.
Your poetry is just so good, everybody needs to hear it. And so he got all of his officers together, had her read poetry. It was like a USO show. It's like Bob Hope going to entertain the troops. And Washington brings in Phyllis Wheatley. I mean, there's so...
Now, what racist is going to bring in and hail this poet that everybody ought to hear? Now, here again, our founding fathers were not perfect, but they were honorable people who I think had a heart for an America that would include everybody.
Well, I'm going to say most of them were, because again, there was about a fourth of them.
Right.
I'm not giving those guys a pass, but the guys that need a pass, we want to give a pass. And there were other guys who never in their life owned slaves, whether it was John Adams, Sam Adams, Roger Sherman, all these other guys. You know, Franklin owned a slave and then freed one, Benjamin Rush. Franklin and Rush both started the abolition movement in America, and both had owned slaves and freed them. And it's interesting that Benjamin Rush, God gave him a dream in which his slave appeared to him in a dream and made him aware of accounting to God. And Rush said, oh my gosh, I don't want to have to account to God for having owned a slave. He freed his slaves, became a national leader of the Anti-Slavery Society. So, I mean, a lot of these guys owned slaves, freed them because they had an epiphany at some point in time. Because when it's like you were saying earlier about abortion, if you grew up in a culture where abortion's all around you, you don't think about it. And so to grow up in a culture that has slavery around you and to think about it and say, that's wrong, I'm going to go against the culture. That's a hard thing to do.
Because how old was George Washington when he inherited his first slaves? 11 years old. Now, so what was at 11 years old? He's supposed to say, "Now wait a minute, I've thought about this, everybody."
Yeah, that's right.
I think, I mean, right? That was the culture he was brought up in. But I say we ought to give the founding fathers tremendous credit for transcending all of that and really going against a lot of the sentiment of the elites around them. And saying this is wrong. I mean, George Washington came, as you know, to denounce it.
Yeah. That's right.
And Thomas Jefferson, on more than one occasion, denounced it.
And see, that's the other thing is, even when we focus on Washington and Jefferson, even those guys are exceptions, they're not the rule. I mean, they were in the South, and they took on their own culture and their own climate to do it. But when you get to the North, when you get to the Adamses and the Roger Shermans and all those guys up north, you're not even talking about owning slaves. I mean, you can't even make the comparison of Jefferson and Washington because they just didn't. And so when we look at slavery and founding fathers, we're going to invariably pick Washington and Jefferson because they owned slaves. Yeah, but even they were an anomaly. Now, if you want to go into Georgia and get Abraham Baldwin and those guys, okay, yeah, they were pro-slavery. But even Washington and Jefferson weren't pro-slavery. But even they weren't typical for most of the founding fathers who didn't own slaves and were anti-slavery. And so again, when we study American history today, we get a heavy dose of South and not North. We just don't know anything that went on up north. I mean, in 1793, John Hancock put on what was called the Equality Ball. Blacks and whites were equal in Massachusetts, and so he did this big ball honoring all the blacks in Boston to show how that we had equality. You know, you don't hear about the equality ball.
You won't hear that. No,
I'm amazed at how much you know about all of this. What happens among your own, blacks when you come out talking about America having a godly heritage?
Well, and we were saying earlier, people who want the truth go like, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
People who have an agenda, who, as you said it earlier, David, truth and facts don't matter.
Yep.
you could just dump facts and truth on them all day long, and they'll just look at you and go, yeah, but.
It doesn't go with my agenda.
That's right. It doesn't. But here again, the importance of this is that there are a lot of people. One of my dearest friends today, a bishop, told me that he and his wife came to an event that I attended. I happened to be one of the speakers, but there were a number of us, and we were talking about these kinds of issues. He said they wept the whole way home. He said, because we realized we've been lied to. We realized we were operating on lies. We were voting Democrat all the time. We just thought, oh yeah, we're black. And they said, no more. Yeah. No more. So I think there are a lot of people out there, when they hear the truth, they have an aha moment.
And if you're raised in that culture and, in a sense, got a chip on your shoulder, you're going to filter everything that you hear through that. And I think that that's why Black Lives Matter is able to get so many people on their side.
They're dealing with
misinformed.
They're dealing with a people who have been miseducated for long enough that now they believe what they've been told.
Yep.
And let me go through some others, because I want to drive home that this is not just about racism. This is about destroying America. And that's why Marxism, it's important that she said, I'm a trained Marxist. Yep. Well, that's not after race. You're after...
That's Prentice Cullors, one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter.
So what you have Philip Schuyler, who's one of the generals in the American Revolution. Here's the monument, Casimir Pulaski. He's a Polish general in the Revolution, came over here, anti-slavery guy, but he's got to come down because he's a founding father. You have Thaddeus Kosciuszko, who's another Polish general who came over. He hated slavery. He took his entire life estate to fight slavery, but we had to deface his monument, tear him down. You had the same thing with Louis XVI, because he's the French king of France that supported the American Revolution and sent the Navy and Army over here. So since he supported America, he's got to go. This is the tomb of the unknown soldier of the American Revolution. So we're going after the unknown soldier of the American Revolution. Then you see this one. This is the pioneer fathers who founded the University of Oregon. Now, I'm not sure what racism we're talking about here. They all go on the Oregon Trail. They cross the mountains. They say, hey, now that we're over here, let's get a school for our kids. Built the University of Oregon, but got to tear them down. Can't have them. Matthew Maury, who's a great scientist, the father of meteorology, the father of oceanography, got to get rid of him. This thing about Jesus is a racist, and he's got to go. So
And why is Jesus a racist?
Man, my goodness.
He's white? Or
How about you seen all the pictures in Sunday school? He's white. Hey, time out. Newsflash for everybody. Jesus is a Jew, which makes him a half-brother of Muslims, Isaac Ishmael, which I don't know of anybody who calls Muslim white. And Jesus is a half-brother of Muslims. Somehow he's white today. Newsflash, Jesus is not a white guy.
You know what that says to me is that this, what we call political correctness and all of these things, it is nothing but the spirit of Antichrist. Yeah. It is not against Muslims. It's not against anything. It's against godly principles.
It is.
Darkness hates light.
Light. And that's why all across Florida we've seen these statues of Jesus being beheaded now. This was a Catholic memorial to World War II, Catholics who died in World War II. They burned that and tried to destroy it. The statue of Virgin Mary decapitated. Here's another statue of Jesus where they decapitated the statue. They have gone after Catholic priest Junipero Serra, the founder of California. They've taken his statues, defaced them. You have the church that he built in 1771 that they burned down. So that church has been burned down. Louis the Ninth, another Catholic saint, St. Louis is named after him, defaced that. Juan de Oñate, who was, he opened up really kind of the southwest of the United States, but he was a missionary, defaced that one. They talk about how that God, that Catholic God's not our God. The churches, man, they're going after them with satanic symbols now and just desecrating churches. In the last
that seems pretty obvious that is just demonic. It's not normal.
Yeah.
Well, and it's so many of them. I mean, last week 11 churches were desecrated that way.
Burning Bibles.
Burning Bibles. Then the St. John's Church in D.C., the Church of the Presidents, they burned it, and then they came back a week later and did it again. Then you've got George Whitefield, the revivalist of the First Great Awakening. His statue has to go. By the way, while we're at it, let's take down the Ten Commandments. And so vandalize Ten Commandment statues, burning Bibles in Portland. The Armenian genocide, these were Christians who were slaughtered in World War I by the Turks. And so we do a memorial to slaughtered Christians.
Turks, yep.
And so that one's gone. Theodore Roosevelt, who was a farthest thing from a racist. Native Americans loved him, and what he did to make equality for blacks and whites. I actually posted that came out 1801, because he's the first guy to have blacks dine in the White House with him, and he knew it was going to create riots, and he did, and he still did it. And so somehow he's a racist now. He's actually a breakthrough guy. Texas Ranger statues are coming down. This one of Baldwin, Thomas Baldwin, was one of the leading abolitionists in Boston, and so they've defaced his statues. They call him a colonizer, an abolitionist, and they call him a colonizer. You know, I can keep going through the Lincoln Memorial, the World War I Memorial, the World War II Memorial. This is not about racism. This is about anything that's venerated in America has to come down, and that's why I can understand people. You know, George Floyd talked about at the beginning, not a good deal. But if you think that's what Black Lives Matter is after, is the George Floyd situation, then how do you explain all of those? How do you explain the World War II Memorial, the World War I Memorial? You can't. Mm-hmm. It's really that anti-American thing, and that's what people are buying into, some innocently without realizing.
So let's deal with the real agenda behind Black Lives Matter, the Marxism, and how that Marxists have to create crisis in order to get the people to give up some of their liberties and stuff. You guys address that.
Yeah, Marxism has been insinuating its way into our culture for a long, long time now. Socialism goes, all the way back to the time of John Adams, and societies that were created trying to, in fact, all the way to really to the Jamestown settlement.
That's right.
They tried to figure out a way to, everybody will get everything equally, and it won't matter what you did, how much you worked. And it just never panned out. Well, Marx comes along and creates this system in which he thinks that we're going to free the proletariat. We're going to free all the poor people from the oppression of the capitalists. Well, look, in Europe, where you really did have vastly wealthy people and a lot of extremely poor people, where you had the British oppressing the Irish and on it went, that could develop some cachet, okay? Well, yeah, makes sense. What are we going to do about all these poor people and they can't get a break? And then you come to the United States of America and you see people who start with nothing, being upwardly mobile, get an education. One generation's goal is to let the next generation get an education, become professionals, start businesses, and move up. And guess what? It works. Freedom actually works. But I think the Marxists figured out that classism doesn't work in America, but racism does. If you can build a movement around the bitterness over the past, and you can keep stoking that and driving that, you can create a situation in which you turn, here again, as we were talking earlier, you turn millionaires and billionaires into revolutionaries. Let me say one thing that is a footnote to some of the stuff that David was saying. Look, I'm an American. It's been at least 200 years, maybe longer, since I had any ancestors in Africa. I am an American. I refuse to even use the term African American. I say I'm an American, and we are all Americans of different descent. We all, and frankly, a lot of us, we have a variety of different descents.
That's right.
that are part of our bloodstream. But at what point do we begin to not just oppose what we're against, but restore the sense of patriotism and the sense of love of country? The sense that we have this unique experiment in human freedom that has succeeded beyond anything that's ever existed. The most successful governing document, which, by the way, Frederick Douglass said the Constitution was not a racist document.
That's right. Yeah.
He commended the Constitution.
At one time, he thought it was until he read it.
That's right.
He said that he read it and he realized it was not at all. And at some point, we've got to begin to take this narrative that David is sharing with us about our history and give people again, a reason to be proud of our country and be proud of who we are. We know we're not perfect. We understand that. But neither am I. Neither is anybody watching. Yep. But America's been the greatest place on earth for anybody to live, raise a family, build a business, get an education, do anything in life that you pretty much want to do. And I think that's what Black Lives Matter is intending to destroy, the sense that America's a place of hope and opportunity. Turn it into, no, America's a place of injustice, and it's got to be destroyed.
Well, when you look, even in the last couple of weeks, there's so many sports now coming back online. And look at how the American flag is being treated.
Yep.
Only 2 guys in the NBA did not take a knee to the flag. Now, this is something, 3 years ago, there was a couple of guys taking a knee. Now there's a couple of guys not taking a knee. Look at the 3-year turnover that's happened here. And here's what's interesting. When this started 5 years ago, Colin Kaepernick, whatever, it's because the 4th stanza of the national anthem had a line about the slave and the hireling. And the national anthem, in its 4 stanzas, most people didn't know it had 4, it's got 4, was written by Francis Scott Key. And so Francis Scott Key, because he wrote the national anthem, his memorial in Baltimore has been defaced, destroyed. The one that they tore down just a couple of weeks ago in Golden Gate Park, it's destroyed because Francis Scott Key is a racist. Time out. Francis Scott Key was the Attorney General for Washington, D.C. He was made the Attorney General by the President, and he was probably the greatest attorney in D.C. He was really well paid for private cases, except he took on hundreds of anti-slavery cases for free, pro bono. He freed so many hundreds of slaves on his own time, pro bono, that the newspapers called him the N-word lawyer He was the N-word guy because he freed so many slaves. Now, wait a minute, I thought he's the racist who created a racist national anthem. How is it the guy is called the N-word because he freed so many slaves on his own time, taking no money for doing so? Awesome. And now today, I mean, if you want to protest a flag, protest the Confederate flag. But the U.S. flag is the one that brought freedom and ended that stuff.
Yeah, or the rainbow flag, which everybody sees.
Yeah, well, that's right, exactly right. But it is so crazy when you look at that, because the hireling and slave, the phrase hireling and slave, actually in the 4th verse was Francis Scott Key talking about what the British were doing, that they were imprisoning hirelings and slaves and putting Americans into slavery. So he's not talking about slaves. He's talking about
that's what started that war.
That's what started the war, was the impressment.
Yeah.
You know, we are going to have to take a break because they only have a certain amount of time that they can record. But we're going to come back because there's still some other things I want to talk about. But we are going to take a break. We'll reset and come back. And those of you that are watching live stream, I hope that you'll stick with us. If not, we'll archive all of these things. But I know we've gone long, but we're covering some good stuff. I think this is going to bless people. So let's take a break, and we'll come back in just a little bit.
Join us next time for the Truth and Liberty broadcast. Find tonight's episode and related articles and links at truthandliberty.net. Truth and Liberty is viewer supported. If you'd like to help us continue our live casts, you can make a donation at truthandliberty.net.